Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Professor Nancy Harrowitz. I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies here at Boston University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our annual event of Holocaust commemoration that corresponds to the opening of the gates of Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945. Our event reflects an important ongoing collaboration between Boston University, AJC New England, and the Israeli Consulate. We've been planning and producing these yearly events of Holocaust commemoration for over a decade now. And so I want to take this opportunity to thank Rob Leikind and Diane Lieberman from AJC, as well as the Israeli Consulate, for their support. Our collaboration has been fruitful and significant and continues to grow. I want to do a special shout out to Diane Lieberman, who's here in the front row, because she was particularly instrumental this year. My thanks also to the staff of the Elie Wiesel Center, especially Jeremy Solomons and Teresa Cooney, who put all the details together. Thanks also to our new program in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies at Boston University for support for today's program. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the program, at the end of the panel discussion. Please note that the ushers, who you will see in the aisles pretty soon, I think, will have cards and pencils for you in case you did not pick them up at the registration desk. Please write down your questions on these cards, give them to the ushers that'll be wandering around looking for them, and then they'll go to the moderator, and your questions will be asked from stage. The film that we're going to discuss today, The U.S. and the Holocaust, came out last fall to critical and popular acclaim. Directed by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein, it engages important contemporary questions for us, as well as offering an unflinching look at the past and at the role of the United States in the Holocaust. Why were there not more rescues of European Jews? What were the reasons for inaction, for indifference to their plight? What are the consequences of indifference? As the historian John Foote has written in his book on divided memory, quote, "Memory is and remains a battleground for the hearts and minds of the people." As a professor of Holocaust film, this concept has great resonance for me. It underscores the importance of film in the creation of the memory of historical events and how we respond to that memory. Even if the facts that underlie our cultural memories are difficult to face, at times even divisive, an honest look at our past is crucial in order to understand our present as well as our future. Which parts of our history are convenient to remember and which are not? One of the truly stunning questions that this documentary asks is, what role did our own racist history play in the U.S. response to the Holocaust, from slavery to Jim Crow to biologically based theories of eugenics and anti-Semitism? A film such as the one that we are about to discuss is crucial to the formation of public memory, as the film serves as an important reassessment and recalibration of the past. And finally, public memory can have a direct effect on public policy. Increasing racism and anti-Semitism are resurgent and are being normalized in public discourse. Can we take as our guide the way this documentary frames compelling questions as a warning sign about where we are today? Thank you. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Elie Yaknes. She is the Deputy Consul General of Israel to New England. In her previous diplomatic mission, she served at the Israeli Embassy in Warsaw, Poland, as the head of public diplomacy in the Chargé d'Affaires. Prior to this, Elie was based at the Israeli Embassy in Moscow with Israel's Ministry of Defense. She has also worked in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, and she holds a BA in Middle Eastern Studies and Criminology from Bar Ilan University. Elie.
Thank you, Nancy. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I would like to thank our partners at the AJC, Rob, Diane, and the team, and the Elie Wiesel Center. Nancy, thank you very much, and your team. And Sarah, thank you very much for being here and sharing your important work and putting this great event together in honor of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as we will mark on January 27th, the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz death camp. Not many know, but up until 2005, this day was not even officially acknowledged by the UN. Even less people know that behind this important resolution from November 2005 stands the hard work of many, but a personal story of one man and his promise to his mother. That person is today Israel's ambassador to Rwanda, Ambassador Ron Adam, and he is the second generation for Holocaust survivors. As you may know, passing an Israeli-initiated resolution in the UN arena is a very difficult task. That's not the most welcoming stage for us. And Ambassador Adam's determination and the support and the hard work done by other high-ranking officials and the international allies made it possible for him to keep the promise he made in keeping the legacy and the memory of his family's stories and the stories of 6 million other families alive. As years go by, it is crucial for us to continue telling the stories of Holocaust survivors and educating our children and society about the dark times which led to the Shoah and the Shoah itself. Statistics nowadays show that almost 2/3 of Americans between the age of 18 to 39 are not aware of the fact that 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust, and surveys say that although there were over 40,000 concentration camps, ghettos, and death camps across Europe, 45% of Americans cannot even name one of them, and those percentages go up once the age goes down. Holocaust education is crucial. As Elie Wiesel himself said, to forget would not be only dangerous but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. As the numbers of living Holocaust survivors among us goes down, it is important for us to listen to them, honor their memories, and us becoming our job to continue amplifying their voices. There are many in-person and digital initiatives you can take part in doing so, like participating in this event today, so thank you very much for coming, different digital campaigns, and many, many more. On the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz death camp, Holocaust survivor and historian Marian Turski proclaimed the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not be indifferent, he said, because if you are, you will not even notice it when upon your own hand and the heads of your descendants, another Auschwitz will fall from the sky. We do not have the right or privilege not to follow Turski's message. Together, let us make sure that never again and never forget are not just slogans, but realities and promises to our ancestors, future generations, and ourselves as a just society. On a personal note, Nancy mentioned some of my bio, but the most important thing for me is I am a granddaughter for Holocaust survivors. I don't know if on their darkest times they dared to dream to have a granddaughter to be an Israeli diplomat. I'm honored and privileged to be here on their behalf, and thank you very much for taking the time today to come here. Thank you.
We are now going to see a short film clip from the documentary.
There are some events so tragic, we think we'll never forget. Days pass, lives pass, and the lessons we vow to learn pass away with them. It takes work to keep stories alive, to paint a picture of the past, and help the next generation move forward together, so we never forget.
On a sunny March afternoon in 1933, a German businessman and his family went for a stroll in the center of Frankfurt. Otto Frank snapped a picture of his wife Edith and their two daughters, Margot, 7 years old, and Anneliese, just 3. Otto's ancestors had lived in Germany since the 16th century. Merchants and bankers, they were not particularly observant Jews. Otto, a proud officer in the Great War, was a patriotic German. But in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler had come to power, and everything had begun rapidly to change. Jews, Hitler charged, were parasites, not Germans. Nazi thugs roamed the Frankfurt streets, beating anyone they thought was Jewish. Most of the Franks' Gentile friends fell away. Their landlord insisted they find other quarters. Margot was made to sit apart from her classmates in school.
The world around me had collapsed. When most of the people of my country turned into hordes of nationalistic, cruel, anti-Semitic criminals, I had to face the consequences. And though this hurt me deeply, I realized that Germany was not the world, and I left forever.
By the time Otto Frank photographed his family, he and Edith were already planning to move to Amsterdam in the Netherlands. By early 1934, they would be living in a spacious, sunny apartment in the city's river quarter, alongside hundreds of other Jewish families from Germany. They would eventually try to seek a safe haven in the United States, only to find, like countless others fleeing Nazism, that most Americans did not want to let them in.
Here at our sea-washed, sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Emma Lazarus.
In 1883, Emma Lazarus, the descendant of Portuguese Jews who had fled the Inquisition and found sanctuary in Manhattan before the American Revolution, had written a poem expressing what the Statue of Liberty meant to her. But a few years later, Thomas Bailey Aldrich, a writer whose family had also lived in America since colonial times, wrote another poem, warning of what he believed would happen to his country if the Golden Door remained open.
Wide open and unguarded stand our gates, and through them presses a wild, motley throng. In street and alley, what strange tongues are these? Accents of menace, alien to our air. Voices that once the Tower of Babel knew. O liberty, white goddess, is it well to leave the gates unguarded?
I think Americans have a very hard time deciding what kind of country they want to have. We all tend to think of the United States as this country with the Statue of Liberty poem, give me your tired, your poor. But in fact, exclusion of people and shutting them out has been as American as apple pie.
All of my grandparents are immigrants from Eastern Europe. except one grandmother was born here. So I sort of grew up haunted by stories of, as they used to say, the old country, haunted by this story of my grandfather's brother and his family living in a provincial town in eastern Poland. And then they disappeared. All you think about is that they had been consumed by this conflagration that consumed all of Europe.
When Nazi rule began in 1933, there were 9 million Jews in Europe. 12 years later, when the Second World War ended in 1945, at least 2 out of every 3 of them had been murdered.
It's not so easy to put the picture together. The real scale of what happened to people, it is unbelievable. It boggles the imagination. You don't know what 6 million people looks like.
As the catastrophe of what would come to be called the Holocaust unfolded, Americans heard about Nazi persecutions of Jews and others on the radio, read about it in their newspapers and magazines, and glimpsed it in newsreels. Some Americans responded by denouncing the Nazis, marching in protest, and boycotting German goods. Individual Americans performed heroic acts to save individual Jews. Some government officials battled red tape and bigotry to bring Jewish refugees to America. In the end, the United States admitted some 225,000 refugees from Nazi terror, more than any other sovereign nation took in. And by defeating Nazi Germany on the battlefield, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and their allies stopped the killing of the surviving Jewish people in Europe. But during the years when escape was still possible, the American people and their government proved unwilling to welcome more than a fraction of the hundreds of thousands of desperate people seeking refuge.
The Holocaust disrupts any idea that we have of good and evil, of right and wrong. This is a story in which everyone is challenged all the time. We are challenged as Americans, we're challenged as parents, as children, we're challenged as neighbors and as friends to think about what we would have done, what we could have done, what we should have done. And even though the Holocaust physically took place in Europe, it is a story that Americans have to reckon with too.
We tell ourselves stories as a nation. One of the stories we tell ourselves is that we're a land of immigrants. But in moments of crisis, it becomes very hard for us to live up to those stories. I think the impetus should not then be to wag your finger at people in the past and think that we're somehow superior to them, but to struggle to understand why that's such a tension between having a humanitarian ideal and then living up to it on the ground.
Part of our national mythology is that we are a good people, we are a democracy. And we are a democracy, and in our better moments, we are very good people. But that's not all there is to this story. And I think if we're going to congratulate ourselves on our democracy, which I think we should, we also need to face up to the other side.
In the past few years, I've begun to wonder how serious America's commitment to looking at some of the dark marks in its history really is. How can we learn from the past? Where did we go wrong? How can we not go wrong the next time? And I think while there is much we can be proud of this country, the episode of America and the Holocaust is not one that redounds to our credit.
How did America treat its potential refugees? The refugees, they lost their lives because those doors, the golden door was not wide open.
That was an amazing clip, I have to say, as a taste of what the film is about. It's really so. Thank you, Sarah, once again for having made the film. We are very happy to welcome Sarah Botstein to campus. She has, for more than 2 decades, produced some of the most popular and acclaimed documentaries on PBS. Her work with directors Ken Burns and Lynn Novick includes Hemingway, College Behind Bars, the Vietnam War, Prohibition, the War, and finally, Jazz. Currently, she is producing an epic 6-part, 12-hour series on the American Revolution, as well as a project on Lyndon Johnson's life and presidency. She also works on digital and education initiatives in collaboration with PBS Learning Media and WETA Television. Rob Leikind, director of AJC New England, began his career working with elderly Holocaust survivors in Brooklyn, New York. Deeply moved by the experience, he trained to become a civil rights attorney, but eventually left the practice of law to serve as director of the ADL's Connecticut and Boston offices and senior vice president of Hebrew College. In 2008, he became director of AJC's New England office, where he has led an array of initiatives to advance AJC's global campaign to combat anti-Semitism, secure the well-being of Jewish communities here in the United States and around the world, and secure democratic values for all. Rob received his bachelor's degree from Vassar College, an MS from Columbia University, and his JD from the Boston College Law School. If I could invite Sarah and Rob up on stage, please.
So, Sarah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a real honor to have you with us here today.
It's a privilege to be here.
We have a lot of things we want to ask you, and I know that the audience will as well. But let me start with a layup.
Sure.
Which is, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, how you got into this business of filmmaking, and second, given the wide range of topics that you've worked on, with, how did you come to this one? What was the driver for taking on such an ambitious film, especially given the fact that there's been a lot done on it?
Maybe I'll work my way backward from that. We were approached in 2015 by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, as they were in the early stages of an exhibition which is actually still on display at the museum in Washington, called Americans and the Holocaust, looking at similar issues, how the American people responded as the humanitarian crisis facing the European Jews, which then became the Holocaust, unfolded. And did we think that would be an interesting topic for a documentary? And for Ken and Lynn, Jeff Ward, our writer, and myself, for similar and different reasons, we all jumped at the chance and actually added it to our schedule. We weren't initially supposed to make this film. So we moved some things around and we started filming in 2018. So that's the origin story of how we got to make the film. The film, for me, of all the films I have worked on, is particularly important. I'm a first-generation American on my father's side. My father was born in 1946. My grandparents were refugees then in Zurich, Switzerland, and came here thanks to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society in 1949. And my father grew up in a Jewish immigrant community in the Bronx. And I spent most of my childhood surrounded by Holocaust survivors and my grandparents. Very personal history for me, and actually in making the film, learned a lot about my family history and details of who was where and how they were killed that I hadn't actually known before. And then all the way back, I was lucky enough when I went to Barnard College in New York and I graduated. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I met Ken at my first job, and a couple of years later he offered me a job on our jazz series, and I packed up my things and moved to a teeny tiny town in New Hampshire where he lives, and have had the great honor of working with him and for him ever since. So that's answer to your first question.
It's a great story.
Why make this film now? Why do you think it's relevant today? I know we're kind of jumping in kind of deeply right away, but it's something I've been wondering about ever since I saw it.
Right. Well, I think, as I was saying, because we decided to make the film in 2015 and we started shooting in 2018, I think the relevance, the resonances, the fact that the film has had the impact and has been the engine for conversations that it has been, I think, is unexpected for us. The urgency to make a film like this now is in part that there are still survivors alive, and so for all of you who work in this history, recording testimony is obviously hugely important. So we wanted to, I feel like there's a technical issue. Hang on. We have
your microphone, evidently.
All right. Anyway, I don't think we expected it to be as relevant as it is, and that's actually sort of a sad state of democracy here and around the world. But the urgency, I would say, is it's helpful, as you said in your very beautiful opening remarks, to look squarely at the past to try to make a better future, and this film is a very, very good way to do that.
So one of the things that comes to mind when watching it, when you were creating this film, did you conceive of yourself as retelling a history, or were there important points that you wanted to illuminate through the process of filmmaking, and how did you bridge that gap?
Well, I think that goes to...
Let me interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
Because you don't have a microphone, it will... Yeah, he's swapping out the...
I'll try to repeat the question in my answer.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So the question is how, I'm gonna paraphrase your question. How do we approach a topic like this, and do we go, start off by trying to answer a certain question? What's our methodology, basically? And I'll say that our methodology, for those of you who are familiar with our work, I don't know how many of you have seen our other films or other work that Ken has done. People are often surprised when we have conversations like this that we really approach every topic that we do exactly the same way. So we decide we're going to make a film about a subject. Most of the time, we are not experts in the topic, and certainly none of us are experts in Holocaust studies or the American response to the events leading up and during the Holocaust and the Second World War. So the first thing we do is we read a lot. We figure out the scholars around the world and the writers and thinkers who have spent their lives focusing on that subject. We think about who is alive, who can bear witness to that history, and would they be willing to talk to us? And we very organically go about the way anyone would, just trying to learn and soak up as much information as we can. And while we're doing that, we stumble upon either the myths that we tell ourselves, the popularized way that we think about certain moments in history, the way that we're taught history that is problematic or feels very, very divisive. When we find something that historians really like to disagree about, that makes us very interested in that question. Usually a good moment for a movie. So one of the powers of documentary film is that you can have a variety of perspectives sit at the equivalent of a dining room table and have a conversation. And we work very traditionally. We work chronologically. We work with very spare, stripped-down narrative that's mostly fact-based. And then we have historians, first-person witnesses in this case, and writers and intellectuals like Daniel Mendelsohn help us understand those facts and those historical sort of academic debates. And so this film was no different. That's the way we approached the topic. What was different in terms of the witnesses to the time are the people who are alive today who survived this history were children then. So you're dealing with childhood memory, childhood trauma, how to make sure that we give the survivors and the witnesses the safest space and the most amount of time to tell their story, but then also verify their story, get their families involved, and then braid their personal stories into the traditional, more sort of academic history. So that's whether we're making a film about Ernest Hemingway or Vietnam or Prohibition or this, we really do approach it in very similar ways.
You mentioned that sometimes you find disagreements among historians, and that is sort of the nucleus for a film. Did you find that in this project?
I mean, I think that you all probably know this. I think the most contentious questions around this history are, trying to really understand FDR and what motivated him to do more or less at different moments. The question of bombing the rail lines leading into Auschwitz is obviously a very contentious topic. We don't go into the politics of Israel, which is obviously very complicated, especially for this group. So, and also I think Americans typically like to think that we didn't know very much about what was happening to European Jewry. And that is actually, I think, the most important thing that we have to come to terms with as a country, that in 1933 alone, there were 3,000 articles about what was happening, let alone after Kristallnacht and the other major events where there were reporters covering the stories. The images hadn't come back, and obviously a lot of what happens to the populations and communities wasn't totally understood. But the question that there was a crisis and a humanitarian crisis on a scale that was incomprehensible was not a secret.
That's an interesting myth, though, isn't it? One of the post-war myths that get created after war to make usually a country look a little better is that people here didn't know about the Holocaust when, in fact, people and the State Department and the Vatican all did fairly early on. And I'm really glad that the film talks about that, really exposes that information without pointing a finger and saying, by the way, you're all wrong about this. In fact, there's the evidence.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah.
I'd love to pursue another, I don't know if you call it a myth, but something really I found very disturbing in the film, among an unsettling film to start with. You talk about the fact that Hitler and the National Socialists found inspiration from the United States in how we treated someone. Can you hear me now?
Okay, we all love a handheld mic, just so you know. At Florentine Films, that's always the way to go.
All right, so let me start over again.
Yeah.
There's so much in this film that's unsettling, but one thing that really struck me was the idea that you presented so vividly, that the United States was really the role model for the National Socialists in their plan to destroy European Jewry. The film references the treatment of the indigenous American community, the effort to create a genocide to make space for them, the whole example of disabled people who become the focus of eugenic plans to destroy them, the creation of racial laws that denied basic fundamental rights and legitimized the dehumanization of people who were black Americans. This is an extraordinary statement that almost seems to create a moral equivalency between the United States, the actions of the United States, and the actions of the Nazis in Europe. I'm wondering what kind of response, if any, you've received to that presentation. Are people critical of it? Do they welcome it? Is it being mobilized for political purposes? It's a stunning thing as an American to contemplate.
Well, thank you for that question. You know, before the film came out, there were a lot of questions about how the film was structured and why does it get to the third episode before you're really in the American War? And one of the reasons is an answer to your question, that it felt extremely important to us to understand and to really look squarely at our founding, which is the displacement and dislocation and murder of Native peoples, which Hitler definitely took inspiration for as he moved east the way we moved west. I had not understood that until working on the film, and Timothy Snyder, the great thinker and historian, was very helpful in us understanding that, along with the really important dynamics of Hitler and Stalin in the Second World War. And I think the question of race in America and our race laws as inspiration is the word I usually like to use for Hitler and the Nuremberg laws is really striking and is very shocking, and something that I think our country is coming to terms with, needs to come to terms with, will forever be thinking about. And I don't think it's useful or helpful to get into a shameful stance about it. I think it's helpful to think about ways that we can be instructed by the darker moments in our past. And that is definitely one. I think it's also surprising for audiences to hear that the Nuremberg laws were not as complicated and strict as our race laws. So that is also something we need to think about.
Just personally, I was very appreciative of that aspect of the film. I thought it was just very, very important to look at that continuum of racism since slavery all the way through, and to think about, I mean, historians have known this for a while, that Hitler was in fact taking the US eugenics laws as a model, and they were the worst really in the world. They were the strictest and the most harsh about the unacceptability of great swaths of people, that he was really taking that as an inspiration, taking the indigenous peoples' genocides as an inspiration. It's pretty shocking, but it is part of our past that we need to think about.
Yeah.
And I think these chapters really are not told very often. They are starting to be told.
Right.
So that's why I was just extremely appreciative that you guys framed the film like that. You started to be, I saw a little hint right when I started watching. I thought, aha, this is a framing, not just of the Anne Frank story, which we can talk about in a minute, but also of the racist past in the US and how it connects to the inaction during the Holocaust. And then, of course, the final part in which you talk about Charlottesville and everything that's happened since the Holocaust. And we have a continuum that's a very important framing of that. So thank you for that. But I did wonder, were there internal discussions about how much of that to highlight? Were there disagreements among the directors, for example? Were you all pretty much on the same page from the start about that particular aspect of the film?
Well, I think, all our films, for each of us who work closely on them, Ken always says this, and he's right, and it's a very thoughtful way to describe what we do, but our films are really, we try to take the viewer as well as ourselves on a journey of discovery, of a process of discovery. So we don't really have a clear-eyed view of how a film is narratively going to unfold until we're working on it. So it became very important to us that we, as I said earlier, focus on our early history and these questions in the early part of the 20th century. I think the other piece of that is how easily humans dehumanize each other and rank ourselves. And so immigrant groups do the same thing. They might be the same color, but one immigrant group comes here and establishes themselves and looks down at the next immigrant group coming. The Jewish population here was not a monolith. There were Jews who had been here for a long time who looked down on the Jews who were coming in the early part of the 20th century. So we have to deal with how we other ourselves consistently in history and in American history for sure. So how much of what we aren't going to do, we really can't tell until we're in the editing room. And who says what about that? How much material is there? Eugenics is obviously really important. Surprising people were for eugenics. Sort of falls into this utopian moment in American world thought about what is utopian societies. That's fascinating. So, the other piece of it is that I think we don't often talk about anti-Semitism as a piece of this. So, the racist, nativist, xenophobic America is very anti-Semitic, and American anti-Semitism is different from European anti-Semitism, and I think comes in waves and sometimes is less and more, and we're right now living through a real crisis, I would say, of an acceptance of hate speech, of racist tendencies, and acceptance of anti-Semitic rhetoric.
I'd love to follow up on this whole discussion about anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'd love to follow.
I heard you.
Let me try to. Thank you.
Yes,
I'd love to follow up on this whole discussion about anti-Semitism. The films create a portrait of the United States where anti-Semitic ideas were really embedded in the culture. And then I think many of us who grew up after World War II found a much more gentle America. And now today, there's the thought that many in the Jewish community have that the vacation from history is over, and that we're returning to the historic normal again.
Right.
Whether that's true or not, we'll find out in several decades.
Yeah.
Right, but for the moment, the conversation within the Jewish community is loud.
Yeah.
Anxiety is high.
Yeah.
Given your study of the history, do you think that there are any lessons for the Jewish community today beyond we need to do something before a Holocaust happens? Do you think there are any lessons for the Jewish community that actually can be translated from the pre-World War years to this time today?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have an answer for it. I think one of the things we discovered in making the film, which is obvious to everybody once you think about it for 2 minutes, is that the Jewish community is not always united, and we tend to be fractured ourselves. And I think confronting hate generally and acknowledging that we are in a crisis is the first step and hugely important. I think one of the things I would say, taking from the film and that we've taken from history, is it's surprising when someone like Kanye does what he did, or people with big platforms spew hate speech. It is surprising how few equally important people push back. So that is where I would say we should be focusing our attention. Why aren't equally loud voices saying no? And I think in looking back at the early part of the 20th century, the accepted norm of anti-Semitic ways of being, and the most popular Americans being some of the most virulently anti-Semitic, we should be done with that now, and we certainly are not.
Do you want to follow up with another question about it? I'm just thinking we could stay on this theme for a minute.
Sure. So this may be a related question, but by the end of the third film, the third part.
Prof, microphone.
Yeah.
You think I'd learn? But by the end of the third film, one has a sense, or at least I did, that the film is unmasking certain truths about this country, our people, our character, our culture, and that sort of put a dent in the notion of American exceptionalism. I was going to say, do you think that's the case? And what are some of those truths that you think are made evident by all the work that you did and what you presented ultimately?
Well, I think American exceptionalism keeps getting in our way, so we should be wary of it. And I think the other thing to say on that subject is that we are a great experiment in democracy. And at the end of the film, for those of you who've seen it, there's, I think, a very powerful conversation between Daniel Mendelsohn, Guy Stern, Timothy Snyder, and Nell Painter about where we are as a society, and these streams of white supremacy keep happening, that, you know, democracies are fragile. Hitler came to power very, very quickly. Institutions crumble very fast. You have to protect them. And there is much to be prideful and grateful about this country. I think one of the things that is, you know, informative and important, and certainly was in my life, that my grandparents started their odyssey to get here in 1935, and they were quite privileged, and they had all the right connections, and they didn't get here until 1949. And instead of being angry about how hard it was to get here, they were so grateful to the opportunity that America gave to them. And you can hold two opposing views. That's human nature, right? We're all that way. Life is complicated, we're complicated, our country is complicated. But we want to lean, I would say, toward the great things about this country, to preserve it, to make a greater future, because we are one of the great experiments in democracy. We were the most powerful nation at the end of the Second World War. I think it's important for people to think about and put themselves in Roosevelt's position in 1933, 35, 39, 41. We had we were so isolationist after World War I for totally understandable reasons. We were coming out of the great economic dislocation of the 20th century. We had an army smaller than that of Bulgaria. And he's facing a humanitarian crisis on a scale no one could possibly have imagined, and a real military crisis, which turns into the Second World War. And so the repeal of the Neutrality Acts was a really terrifying position for our country and our government, as well as combating the humanitarian crisis. So I think we should never oversimplify anything. And good history makes things very complicated and hopefully relatable. So American exceptionalism is dangerous. It's just, I'm making a film about the American Revolution. We fought against a great empire and pretty quickly became one. So how do you, but, we learn something every time. So, I don't want to be overly optimistic or Pollyanna about it, but I do think the thing I take away is I've gotten much more involved in my local school board, our local congressional race. My grandparents got dressed up and voted for every single election and took us with them. I take my children with me. I think it is our responsibility to vote, and it's surprising how few of us do. Mm-hmm. So that's my sort of roundabout answer to that question.
I think this yeah, it is. I think this question actually segues into that in, I hope, obvious ways, but maybe not so much. So the film talks a lot about how America sees itself as a nation of immigrants, right? The Golden Door, the Statue of Liberty, Emma Lazarus, and contextualizes that beautifully against the xenophobia and the racism of the period, right? You have those figures sort of speaking against what Lazarus is doing. You have a Statue of Liberty and attitudes towards the Statue of Liberty, attitudes towards immigration, which are very much against immigration during those years. Mm-hmm. The Johnson-Reed Act, which is, of course, earlier, but a lot of steps, a huge number of Americans not feeling they want to let in immigrants at all, but especially not European Jews.
Right.
So can the U.S. still see itself as a nation of immigrants? Is that question still alive today?
Well, for sure, that question of do we see ourselves as a land of immigrants and do we want to be one is alive and well today, I can tell you. We all know that, right? Just turn on the news. But I think Ken and Lynn deserve an enormous amount of credit for setting up not just the Emma Lazarus poem, but Thomas Bailey Aldrich, who, those of you who don't know who that was, he was the editor of The Atlantic at the time. So this is not somebody on the fringe. This is a voice of reason that people are reading and listening to. And I think many people have commented on the fact that I think for us, setting the poem up the way we do in the beginning, and then we return to the Statue of Liberty at the end of the film, because that tension of what kind of a country we are and want to be and will become is central. And each generation seems to wrestle with this question. Are we a land of immigrants? Or do we want to lean into our nativist, racist, white supremacist, anti-Semitic tendency? And so that tension existed at our founding, basically. It's still, and what is surprising for me, and I have said this a lot, is I don't see any historic evidence that immigrant populations do anything but make our country stronger and greater and more worth defending. So why we can't reframe that argument for a generation to just be done with it is really surprising to me.
I want to ask one more question before we open up to questions.
What did I get? Yes or no?
A well-trained audience.
I am less trainable than I seem, but so I think that the looming question that lurks in just about every publication and film and artwork concerning the Shoah is, how do we want it to be remembered? Mm-hmm. How do we want the Shoah to be remembered? How do we want it to be understood? Through all the work that you've done, do you have a sense of how you would answer that question yourself?
Well, I think it's one of the great tragedies in human history, and so it's worth exploring, thinking about, remembering, talking about, honoring over and over again. So I don't take one single meaning from it. I don't think there's a time when we shouldn't consider it and think about it and try to draw lessons from it. I think it's a watershed moment in human history for all of us to think about, whatever our direct connections may or may not be.
Thank you. We have a lot of audience questions, so I don't know that we'll get through all of them, but they're wonderful questions.
Okay.
I just read through them. Any other questions out there? I think we have an usher running around, I hope, looking for questions. Well, our usher will go around and collect questions while we start with the questions. Let me start with this one. Have you listened to Rachel Maddow's Ultra about the America First movement and the level that Nazi spies were working with members of Congress? How did that history figure in to Roosevelt's decision? That's a tough question, if I may say so.
So I have listened to half of Ultra. It's downloaded on my phone. I'm going to continue to listen. I don't have a direct answer for that. The thing I found most shocking and surprising that I wish it had come out before we, it had come out before we made the film, is to put Father Coughlin actually into slightly better context, because it's not just, we mention him in the film, you hear from him, you understand him, but what I think Rachel Maddow does beautifully in the podcast is to squarely explain how powerful and widespread his audience is. There's only 3 radio stations. He has something like 8 million listeners a day. It is very hard for us to understand the impact of that now, because our news is so fractured. There isn't a centralized place where there are only 3 ways to get the news and be influenced. So that, I think, is really important. To the Congress, I do think we try in the film to show, particularly in the State Department, how virulently anti-Semitic the State Department was and how hard they made it for refugees to get here. And I think to hide behind, bureaucratic red tape and following the visa regulations is, I've said this a lot, the film is in some ways, a film about paperwork. And the one thing we have learned and can learn is that in moments of crises where it involves refugee populations, shove the paperwork, get them here, and then figure out how to document it, not the other way around. I mean, any of you have tried to get your passport renewed. It's impossible, and we're living in the easiest time to do something like that. So if you're in a crisis where you're having to flee where you live and you have to make sure you have the right documentation or you're not going to get on the ship, that's where I think we, so, you know, that's a roundabout answer to that. Yes, we had very, very anti-Semitic people with all kinds of connections working at the highest level of government.
There was also the Christian Front, which had as its main location Boston. There's a book called The Nazis of Copley Square by Charles Gallagher, which is very interesting about the kind of influence this group had, led by a Nazi who had a nice brick house in Chestnut Hill. I was pointed the house
Well,
out.
you know, I mean, it's like after the war, the people ask me what surprised me. What really shocks me is that after 1945, we didn't want to let in refugees, and we were more likely to let in Nazi sympathizers and Nazis because of the Cold War than we were refugees. So that's, you know, we have a complicated record in this subject.
We do, but not only us. I mean, there was the Vatican letting in, saving Nazis from persecution by taking what was called the rat line through the Vatican into South America, because they were serving as spies against Russia. But it's really, that part of the history to me is one of the most shocking moments.
I agree. The new Pope deserves some credit around anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So we are making progress.
So a segue to the Roosevelt question is that the person asking the question feels that the series seems to let Roosevelt administration off the hook a little bit, especially in regards to the non-bombing of the tracks at Auschwitz. What's your take on that?
We've gotten that a lot, and so I'm really happy to have as much of a conversation about that as I can. You know, we asked every historian we interviewed on and off camera about Roosevelt, and I think we're at a time where trying to understand why he did what he did. Again, you know, those of you who've seen the film, there is a major scene on the question of the bombing of the rail lines, and the two historians who we interviewed don't entirely agree. And I think us as filmmakers, we try not to put our own opinion directly in the film, so we wanted to have the audience hear the argument and hear the conversation about it. So would it have sent a message? That's a very interesting question to me. Would it have done anything substantive and substantial? I really don't think so. And so I think the message part of whether we should have bombed is the thing that's an interesting conversation for us to have. But I actually have come to really appreciate the things that Roosevelt did without trying to draw too much attention to it all the way through the war. And I think he deserves enormous credit also for the War Refugee Board and rescuing the Hungarian Jews in 1944, which he gets very little credit for.
Great,
and
thank
he really should. Morgenthau and he and the Treasury Department should get extra credit for that.
You might have answered this already, but what were some of the things that you learned in making the film that surprised you?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about the things that surprised me, the connections to our own past, our Native America, the history we have with our Native people, our race laws, how we push each other down as a society so frequently. Again, I learned an enormous about my own family. I had my great uncle was one of the architects of the Warsaw Uprising and went back into the ghetto to fight against the Nazis. I had a great aunt who killed herself in front of them when they took her children to Treblinka to try to understand. You know, I think one of the things about studying this time period, whatever piece of it you're trying to understand, is why people made certain choices. Who are the rescuers? Who are the perpetrators? Why does a Polish Catholic family hide a family and why does another one sell them out? Why does a Quaker family in Iowa take in a family of Jews and the Jewish community doesn't? Why do we make certain choices and decisions in moments like this are excellent questions for us to wrestle with and learn from, hopefully.
I have a question about Ron DeSantis and his relationship to. Right, I was going to read the question because we're not taking. Sure, go ahead.
I have arthritis. I'm a little overweight, so I would rather ask. Okay, my daughter right now is in the middle of a lawsuit in Florida against the government there because they're trying to eliminate what you can teach in the colleges and in the schools.
Right.
which is about civil rights and LGBTYN and all
Right.
this stuff that's going on. And it is absolutely frightening.
Mhm.
She, instead of just sitting there and not doing anything about it, she decided to do something and fight it in the courts. It's taken everything out of her. She got sick at the end of it. But it's so frightening to see if they can do it with that, they can do it with anything. You know, and the Holocaust is terrific. This was a wonderful thing that you did. But I wonder how many people that weren't Jewish saw it and took it all in as to what it was.
That's a great question.
It is a great question.
It's a great question.
But it isn't.
Thank you.
Can you
Schools, and I think it's being eliminated a lot.
can you rephrase the question?
There's facing history,
Yeah.
but that's.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can you rephrase? Can you paraphrase that a bit?
I could talk a little bit about education if you want, and sort of how we think about education. So one of the reasons that we work in public television and we work with PBS, and those of you who live here have a great, WGBH is a great station in the system, is that our films tend to live on in the classroom. So we create lesson plans and we work with Facing History, Echoes and Reflections, Shoah, the Holocaust Museum, to actually have teachers who don't normally teach the Holocaust create lesson plans around American identity and American history, and particularly for students today around media literacy, so that students can think about, and we didn't have a chance to really talk about this, but you know, who's taking the photograph? What are you looking at? How do you understand documentary evidence? How do you think about images that are coming at us and respond? So the education crisis that teachers are on the front lines of the culture war here and of how we're gonna, you know, reframe our history and our future. So we are in great support of teachers. We think teachers, you know, deserve way more credit than they get.
Thank you. Question from someone who says her mother in New York City watches your films whenever they're on PBS and can't get enough, what she said about it. She asked, how can we make it possible for more people to see this film, this important film, and what can we do here at BU? I've actually, by the way, written asking for a license so that we would have the film to show in classrooms.
Right, so you should be able to get that through whatever the education wing of PBS. But the film is still, this month for Holocaust Remembrance is streaming free on PBS. You can get it on Amazon. If you're a member of PBS Passport, you can watch it whenever you want. And we do an enormous amount, as I said, in the classroom. And because history teachers and social studies teachers and language arts teachers tend to teach this history in the spring, we don't really know how the film will be used in classrooms. And also to the question of who watches, I mean, hopefully it's not just Jewish people who are interested in this, but people who are interested in American history, and our general PBS core Ken Burns fan club will watch it. A very small portion of them are probably Jewish.
Well, I can say in my Holocaust film courses here at the university, I would say only maybe 20% of the students are Jewish. That the topic of studying the Holocaust through film appeals to a wide swath of students. I get international students, business students, et cetera, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah, me too.
Actually.
It's good.
Oh, okay, here's a good one. Actually, they're all good. These questions are amazing. All documentaries are editorialized.
Yeah.
How do you try to balance the information presented? For example, FDR's responsibility towards the Jews in World War II.
So yes, I mean, right, there's nothing as objective, really. I think, you know, we work with our editors who deserve an enormous amount of credit for culling through huge amounts of material and then trying to present it in a way that is visually interesting, historically accurate. We're, you know, I think I've never made a film about anything I really know very much about. And so lots of documentary filmmakers make films about the subject they've spent their whole lives studying. And I am grateful that I have never made a film about anything I know a lot about, because it permits me to just, best part of my job and our job is to find people with different points of view, argue their position so that they can have a conversation, so we can try to understand in as, I'm not sure objective a way as possible, because we're making a film is also art, right? We're trying to make something that's beautiful, painful, long-lasting, true in some larger way. But I think I don't ever want to work on a film where we have one point of view and we're just going to get on that train and go for it. I think I love to make films about complicated subjects that you feel one way one minute and another way another minute, and make people walk away with questions rather than answers. I think having people think about things they don't normally think about and then wonder how to apply that to their lives is sort of the more animating principle.
How to make it relevant. And in fact, I think the end of part 3 makes it absolutely relevant. And that's one of the reasons that ending is so important. If you haven't seen it, I was in tears at the ending of part 3. I thought it was really beautiful and very eloquent and articulate and really pulled a lot of threads together for me.
I think it was really
and your choice of historians was really great, actually, in the film. The documentary, this is another question, the documentary has received great praise and deservedly so. Yet there is one common criticism to which I would like your response. The ending of the series, this is actually very relevant what I just said, seeks to universalize the lessons of the Shoah by its focus on George Floyd, Charlottesville, and anti-immigration sentiment today.
Right. So I think I can talk a little bit about why we chose to end the film the way that we did, and I wish I could just channel Ken onto the stage and Lynn too, but how we started the film and how we ended the film are always, for any topic, take us the longest amount of time to figure out. And the discussions with our historians and amongst ourselves, do we end the film in 1945? Don't think so. Do we end the film in 1965, which is when we have the second most important immigration law passed in response to the 1924 Act that we were talking about earlier? Well, that's really interesting. We should really include that. Johnson gives that speech about that law at the Statue of Liberty. But Charlottesville happened while we were making the film. Pittsburgh happened while we were making the film. January 6th happened while we were editing the film. And so the through lines of anti-Semitism, racism, the fragility of democracy that we were talking about are connected to the questions of the Holocaust, but they're really connected to the questions of the US response to. So what kind of a country we are, what kind of a country are we going to be, what happens when our country confronts crisis. So those, I think, were the reasons we did what we did at the end of the film, less to make a judgment about the Holocaust, but more to make a connection to the early history and the history that we're living in now.
Do you remember what one of the historians says? It might have been Daniel Mendelsohn about, he's talking about white supremacy, and he says, well, you might think it's that person you have no contact with, but it could be the person that works at the dry cleaners.
Yes.
It could be the person in the coffee shop. It could be anybody. And it's very chilling, but it's also true.
Right. He's talking about just institutions and how we as human beings function. So he's really a philosopher, and he's very brilliant. And he said, once somebody says to you, it's okay to shoot a grandmother on Saturday and go to church on Sunday, something is terribly wrong. And those people are all around you, and they're all around the community that you live in. And Ambassador Lipstadt did a talk with her this week, and she was saying, that's what's so shocking to her about the incident in Buffalo that happened earlier this year. There's a kind of racist tone to it, and then his manifesto is very anti-Semitic. And so trying to really acknowledge where we are as a country in terms of these questions of race, of immigration, because the tree of life is an immigration. The person who perpetrated those crimes was angry about immigration. So they're not legacies directly from the Holocaust. They're legacies of our American identity, I would say.
But there's a connection to the Holocaust,
right.
Because it's really focuses on the fragility of democratic
and that's
societies.
Right, it's a philosophical question of how did Germany succeed in doing what it did.
We have time for one more really quick question, except I don't think this is a quick question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
Do you believe the U.S. would have joined the war if it hadn't been for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor?
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Good answer.
That's a very long conversation, which we should not have. I don't really know I don't have an answer.
Yes, sorry, I shouldn't have ended with that one. Well, let me ask one more quick one.
Yeah.
Was the reception to the work a surprise in any way?
I think its relevancy is surprising. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, but I think that's actually a great way to end the program. I'm afraid we have run out of time.
Thank you all very much.
First of all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been an illuminating conversation. It really is, and I think you've taken it from a story about the Shoah to really the struggle for a democratic society. How does it encounter events like this then and continuing to? And I think those are difficult and honest questions which we need to struggle with, I guess, as long as this republic continues.
Yes.
So really, thank you so much. It's
Thank you
really
for
an
having
extraordinary
me.
event. We've been doing this program annually, and we do it to learn, to try to understand. But the other reason we do it is because we want to remember and honor the memory of all those who perished. And we're fortunate to have with us today Cantor Elias Rosenberg.
Thank you, everybody, for the honor, the invitation to be here today. In synagogue world and in events like this, we recite a memorial prayer called El Maleh Rahamim, God full of mercy in Hebrew. And I'm going to be chanting that to honor those who perished in the Shoah. So I'm going to ask everybody to rise, please. El Maleh Rachamim, Shochen b'maromim, Ametzei menucha nechona, Tachat kanefei Hashekhinah, B'malod kedoshim utorim, Kezor rakim amazirim, Et nishmot hakedoshim beatorim, שהומתו בשואה, ושנהרגו ושנשחטו, ושנשרפו ושנטבחו, ושנתנחו על קידוש השם, בערך הזכרת נשמותיכם. גן עדן תהיה מנוחתם. לכן אפל הרחמים, אז תראה בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור מצרור החגים, אל נשמותיכם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיכם. ונאמר Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure, whose radiance is like the heavens, to the souls of all the men, women, and children of the house of Israel were slaughtered, strangled, and burned in the Shoah. May they rest in paradise. Master of mercy, may they find eternal shelter beneath your sheltering wings, and may their souls be bound up in the bond of life. Adonai is their portion. May they rest in peace, and let us say together, Amen. Thank you very much.